What is this mess? Ma'am, that's my front lawn you just poured motor oil on. It's called pest control. Learn some respect. Yeah. That's what came out of Karen's mouth at 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, while she was standing on my grass with a half-empty oil jug in her hand. If you've ever had a neighbor try to turn your yard into an environmental crime scene, smash that like button. Subscribe if you believe karma should come with curbside delivery, because what Karen didn't know? That oil wasn't staying on my lawn for long, it was headed straight back to her shiny white SUV. The morning felt ordinary enough until a sour, heavy scent drifted through my open window and made me pause. It wasn't the smell of freshly cut grass or even the neighbor's usual fertilizer. This was darker, thicker, and unmistakably wrong. I stepped outside barefoot, expecting to find maybe a leaking garbage bag or a forgotten can of paint, but what greeted me stopped me cold. My lawn shimmered with a greasy sheen, the dew replaced by a spreading blanket of black liquid that clung to every blade of grass. It looked like someone had turned my yard into the site of a minor industrial accident. At first, I thought maybe a car had leaked oil overnight, but the puddle was too wide and deliberate. My eyes followed the glistening trail up the slight slope of my yard to the sidewalk, and that's when I saw her. Karen was standing there in her robe, clutching an oversized container of motor oil like it was some kind of gardening tool. Her expression wasn't one of guilt or even embarrassment. She looked proud, almost satisfied, as if she'd just performed a public service. She gave the jug a little shake, and I heard the slosh of thick liquid inside. For a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. My toes sank into the damp soil, the oily residue sticking unpleasantly to my skin, and I realized I was standing in the middle of what could only be described as sabotage. My lawn, which I had spent countless weekends mowing, fertilizing, and nurturing, had been transformed into a toxic mess in less than an hour. The sun was just beginning to climb, and in that light the lawn no longer looked green at all. It reflected a rainbow shimmer like gas on water, a surreal and ugly sheen that clashed with the peaceful suburban backdrop. Karen caught me staring and lifted her chin, as if daring me to question her. The sheer audacity left me momentarily speechless. I wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but the words caught in my throat as I stared at the destruction spreading under my feet. What kind of person wakes up, grabs a jug of motor oil, and decides their neighbor's yard is the perfect dumping ground? That was the exact moment I understood the scale of the battle I was about to face. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an accident. It was intentional, calculated, and dripping literally with malice. When I finally managed to ask her what in the world she thought she was doing, Karen didn't even flinch. She looked down at my ruined lawn, then back at me, and launched into what she clearly believed was a perfectly rational explanation. According to her, pouring oil across my grass was part of a natural weed control method. She said it with such conviction, like she had discovered some hidden chapter in a gardening manual that no one else had ever read. Her voice carried that smug tone she always used when she wanted to sound like the authority in any situation. To her, this wasn't vandalism or destruction. It was science, neighborhood beautification, and a personal favor rolled into one. She went on about how my grass was too green compared to the rest of the neighborhood, which apparently disrupted the balance of curb appeal. She claimed that by spreading oil over my lawn, she was preventing weeds from invading other properties. I remember standing there with my arms crossed, listening to her talk as if she were presenting at a garden club meeting instead of standing in the middle of what looked like a small environmental disaster. She had this almost rehearsed cadence, as though she had explained it before, or perhaps planned to justify it long before she tipped the jug. I tried to cut in and explain that motor oil seeps into soil, poisons the ground, and can even reach the water table. Her expression didn't shift. She stared at me like I was being overly dramatic, like I had no appreciation for her so-called contribution to community maintenance. The absurdity of it all made me wonder if she actually believed what she was saying, or if this was just another excuse she had cooked up to cover her tracks. Either way, she was fully committed to the story. As she spoke, I couldn't help noticing the thick black stains spreading further across the grass, forming uneven pools that caught the morning sunday. It was obvious to anyone with eyes that this was destruction, not maintenance. Yet Karen continued confidently, calling it preventative landscaping, and insisting that one day I would thank her for saving me the cost of professional weed removal. The longer she talked, the clearer it became that she wasn't going to admit fault. In her mind, she was the hero of the story, and I was just too naive to see it. That was the moment I realized logic wasn't going to work on someone who could twist poison into protection. I tried to reason with her, thinking that if I broke it down in the simplest possible way, maybe some part of reality would sink in. I explained that oil doesn't just stop weeds, it kills everything it touches. It seeps deep into the ground, making the soil barren for years, and it runs off into drains where it can poison streams and ponds. I even pointed to the sheen already forming where the lawn met the sidewalk, a rainbow stain creeping slowly toward the gutter. She crossed her arms, tilted her head, and gave me that look she always gave when she thought she was the smartest person on the block. Then, in the calmest voice I'd ever heard from her, she said my lawn had been too green anyway and that it was throwing off the balance of the neighborhood. The way she said it left me stunned. Too green. As if maintaining healthy grass was some kind of offense against community standards. I looked down at the place where I had spent hours fertilizing and watering, where I had pulled weeds by hand just to avoid harsh chemicals. All of that effort was now soaked beneath a layer of sludge that glistened like tar in the morning sunday. The smell was sharp and metallic, making my stomach twist. Yet she stood there, perfectly content, as though she had just painted a fence or trimmed a hedge. I told her she was destroying property that wasn't hers. She shrugged and said she was protecting property values, as though she had been elected to some invisible council of neighborhood guardians. The worst part was the calm certainty in her voice. There was no doubt, no hesitation, not even the flicker of guilt. She believed every word she was saying, or at least wanted me to think she did. For a moment, I actually questioned myself. Was I overreacting? Could anyone else see this and believe her version of events? But the sight of my shoes already coated in black stains snapped me back to reality. The grass underfoot was slick, the soil mushy and ruined, and the air thick with fumes. Nothing about this was beautification. It was destruction, plain and simple, wrapped in a bizarre justification that made sense only inside her head. That was the moment I understood that arguing facts with her was pointless. Logic wasn't the language she spoke, entitlement was, and she was fluent. By lunchtime, I thought the morning disaster was behind me, at least until I figured out my next step. I had scrubbed my feet 3 times to get the oily residue off, and had started calling around about soil testing, when I heard a loud knock on my front door. Taped there in bright red ink were 3 violation notices, each one written in Karen's scratchy handwriting and stamped with a logo that I later realized she had printed herself. The first one accused me of improper lawn maintenance, as if the oil spill she created was somehow my negligence. The second claimed environmental hazards and suggested that I had poured chemicals onto my own property. The third, and the one that almost made me laugh out loud, charged me with failure to respect neighborhood harmony. I stood there holding the papers in disbelief. The language was overly formal, the kind of phrasing you would find in a half-baked imitation of a legal document. She even included fine amounts at the bottom, each violation costing $200, payable to the homeowners association. There was just one glaring issue. We didn't have an active homeowners association. It had dissolved years earlier, after too many people grew tired of the endless drama, but that didn't stop Karen from reviving it in her imagination. I glanced across the street, and sure enough, there she was on her porch with a fresh clipboard, watching me read the notices. She smiled like a hunter who had just set a trap. She wanted me to crumble, to panic, to pay her fake fines without question. I raised the papers in the air and shouted across the street that this nonsense wasn't legal, but she only waved and yelled back that she would be documenting my refusal for the community record. The audacity was breathtaking. Not only had she destroyed my lawn, but she was now attempting to rewrite the narrative so I was the villain. I imagined her late at night, sitting at her dining table surrounded by markers and stencils, carefully crafting these counterfeit violation slips like a child playing office. Except her little game wasn't harmless. It was designed to intimidate, to create a paper trail she could wield against me. Holding those notices, I felt my anger shift into something sharper. If she wanted a battle on paper, I was more than ready to collect evidence of my own. I wasn't the only one who had seen what happened that morning, and that became clear when Tom from across the street strolled over later that evening. Tom is the kind of neighbor who keeps to himself but notices everything. He had his coffee mug in hand, and that half-amused, half-concerned look that said he had been waiting for the right moment to share his observations. Before I even opened my mouth, he chuckled and told me he thought Karen was changing her car oil when he first spotted her with the jug. From his porch, he had a clear view of her sloshing the liquid across my grass, and at first he figured maybe she had spilled something by accident. That illusion ended quickly when he saw her deliberately tilting the container like she was watering a flower bed. Tom leaned against my mailbox and shook his head, telling me that he had lived in the neighborhood long enough to know Karen thrived on control. This, though, was new even for her. He described how she marched back and forth like she was carrying out a chore on a checklist, completely unbothered by the mess she was creating. He even admitted that he had pulled out his phone and recorded part of it because the scene looked so absurd. Hearing him recount the details filled me with both relief and disbelief. Relief that I wasn't crazy and someone else had witnessed it. Disbelief that Karen had been so brazen in broad daylight with no attempt to hide what she was doing. Tom's tone was calm, but there was a current of irritation under it, the kind that builds after years of watching someone push boundaries without consequences. He told me flatly that I should keep every scrap of evidence because this wasn't the last time she would try something. As he spoke, I noticed Karen watching us from her porch, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. She must have known Tom had seen everything, yet her expression carried no hint of embarrassment. If anything, she looked defiant, as though daring us to challenge her. The tension between her glare and Tom's quiet testimony struck me as a turning point. It wasn't just my word against hers anymore. I had a witness who had seen her in action and was willing to back me up. That realization planted a small but steady flame of determination in me. If Karen wanted to rewrite reality, she was going to find out that other people had been watching too. If there was one thing Karen loved more than lecturing her neighbors, it was showing off her car. The white SUV was her crown jewel, gleaming like a polished monument in her driveway every weekend. I had watched her spend entire Saturdays buffing the paint, vacuuming the interior, and lining up her cleaning supplies in neat rows like a surgeon preparing for an operation. She treated that vehicle with a level of devotion she never extended to actual people. The neighborhood kids knew not to touch it, delivery drivers learned not to park too close, and she even placed little cones around it during garage sales to keep strangers at bay. She boasted about it constantly, calling it her status symbol, her reward for years of hard work on behalf of the community. In her eyes, the SUV was more than a car. It was proof of her superiority, a rolling announcement that she was the one who set the standard. She once told a neighbor that she wouldn't trust anyone who drove a car with a dent, which made me laugh, considering her own driveway had a crack big enough to swallow a bicycle wheel. The vehicle itself gleamed like it had just rolled out of the dealership, always spotless, always reeking of that strong, cherry-scented air freshener she insisted on hanging from the mirror. It was so pristine that even birds seemed to avoid flying over it, as if nature itself had been warned off. To Karen, keeping that SUV, immaculate, was as important as maintaining her grip on the neighborhood. When she wasn't sitting on her porch surveilling everyone, she was sitting inside the car, idling with the radio on, as though being seen behind the wheel reinforced her authority. That car became the centerpiece of her identity, the one object that gave her a sense of untouchable pride. Which is why the irony struck me so hard as I stood in my yard, staring at the glistening black ruin she had created on my lawn. The thought took root in my mind almost instantly. She wanted to lecture me about property values while pouring poison into my soil, yet she spent hours worshiping a machine parked 10 feet away. The SUV represented everything she valued most, and I realized then that if karma had a delivery system, it was sitting right there in her driveway, shining brighter than the morning Sunday. That evening, after the anger had cooled just enough for me to think clearly, I pulled up the footage from my security cameras. I had installed them months earlier, not because I expected neighborhood sabotage, but because porch pirates had been making the rounds in nearby streets. As the screen lit up with a timeline of clips, I scrolled back to the early hours of the morning. There it was. Karen, in her slippers and robe, striding across my lawn with the jug in hand like she was watering plants. The camera caught every step, every tilt of the container, every glossy pour of oil that shimmered in the rising light. The strangest part was how casual she looked. She wasn't sneaking or glancing around. She moved with the confidence of someone who believed she had every right to do what she was doing. At one point, she even paused to adjust her robe, set the jug on the ground, and check her phone before continuing her little routine. When she finally finished, she walked back across the street with the half-empty container swinging at her side, her expression relaxed, as though she had just completed a chore on her to-do list. Watching it in replay made my stomach twist. Seeing the destruction in person had been bad enough, but watching her calmly carry it out with no hesitation was something else entirely. I noticed the way the oil spread in dark trails behind her steps, the liquid soaking into the grass in waves, leaving permanent scars in its wake. Her slippers must have been coated by the end, yet she didn't even look down. That was the level of disregard she had for anyone else's property. The camera also recorded sound, faint but clear enough to pick up her muttering. At one point, she actually said, "This will keep things under control." Hearing her voice, smug and matter-of-fact, turned my anger into something sharper. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't carelessness, it was deliberate. She had narrated her crime like it was an instructional video. When I saved the clip to my phone, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I finally had proof that couldn't be twisted into one of her fake violation notices or neighborhood speeches. For once, it wouldn't be just my word against hers. I had her in full color, sound included, caught in the act of poisoning my lawn. By Friday afternoon, I learned that Karen had escalated the situation in the only way she knew how. She had called what she proudly labeled a special session of the Homeowners Association, though the association had disbanded years ago. The gathering was held in her driveway, where she had set up 5 folding chairs in neat rows, as if she were running a miniature courtroom. A clipboard rested on her lap, and she spoke with the kind of authority usually reserved for mayors or judges. Neighbors passing by slowed down, curious to see what spectacle she had planned this time. I watched from my window as she stood up and delivered a speech about my property. She claimed my lawn had become a hazard to the entire neighborhood. According to her, the oil covering the projection grass was a sign of negligence and proof that I was dragging down property values. She pointed toward my house with dramatic gestures, speaking loudly enough for anyone within half a block to hear. She accused me of failing to meet community standards, of creating unsafe conditions for children, and of lowering the reputation of the street. What made the scene even more surreal was the way she dressed it up with props. On the hood of her SUV, she had spread out manila folders stuffed with papers that looked like official documents, though from my angle, I could see they were nothing more than printouts with highlighted lines and sticky notes. Every so often, she would lift a sheet into the air and wave it like it was irrefutable evidence of my guilt. The neighbors in the chairs sat politely, though their faces told the real story. Most looked uncomfortable, glancing at one another instead of at Karen. One man fidgeted with his car keys, while another woman leaned back with her arms crossed, clearly unconvinced. Karen carried on as if she had unanimous support, declaring that the association would soon vote on disciplinary measures against me. She scribbled notes as though every hesitant nod or blank stare was a binding agreement. From behind my window, I couldn't help but shake my head. She had built a courtroom out of lawn chairs and was prosecuting me with papers she had made herself. It was both ridiculous and infuriating, but it also showed me just how far she was willing to go to rewrite the truth. As the meeting dragged on, it became obvious that Karen's audience was slipping away from her. At first, the neighbors sat stiffly, nodding politely, as if they were afraid of becoming her next target. But the longer she spoke, the more restless they grew. Her voice rose in volume, her accusations sharpened, and she kept repeating the same phrases about property values and community standards until they lost whatever weight they might have had. People began exchanging glances, small sideways looks that carried more meaning than words. One man whispered something to the woman beside him, and she tried to cover her laugh with a cough. Another neighbor shifted uncomfortably and muttered that it sounded like Karen was the one bringing down the street's reputation, not me. The tension in the air changed, and for the first time, I felt the balance tipping. Karen noticed it too, and her tone became even shriller, as if shouting louder could erase the doubt spreading through her little council. The turning point came when she announced that she would be drafting fines for my supposed negligence. She waved her clipboard like a sword, declaring that anyone who didn't support her was complicit in letting the neighborhood decay. That was when Tom, who had been standing in the back with his arms folded, finally spoke up. He calmly reminded everyone that he had seen Karen dump the oil herself and that the only hazard to the block was her behavior. His voice was steady, and the weight of his words silenced the muttering crowd. Karen tried to dismiss him, insisting he was confused, but the doubt had already spread too far. A woman in one of the folding chairs asked why she had never heard of these emergency sessions before. Another neighbor asked whether Karen had any authority to issue fines since the association had dissolved years ago. The more questions they asked, the less convincing her answers became. From my porch, I watched Karen's confident stance falter as her neighbors shifted in their seats and began packing up. They weren't siding with me openly, not yet, but they were no longer willing to play along with her charade. The whispers had turned into quiet defiance, and I could see it rattled her. For once, she wasn't the one controlling the story. The revolt had started, small but steady, and I knew it was only a matter of time before her entire facade began to collapse. After the fiasco of her driveway meeting, I knew I needed something more solid than neighbor testimony and shaky camera clips. Words could be twisted, but hard science was a different story. That evening, I collected several samples from my lawn, scooping the slick soil into sealable bags while wearing gloves that stuck unpleasantly with each handful. The ground felt heavy and damp, saturated far beyond what a little rain could cause. The smell clung to me even after I double-bagged the samples, a sharp reminder of just how far the damage had spread. I drove the samples to the county extension office the next morning. The clerk at the front desk raised an eyebrow when I slid the bag across the counter, but when I explained the situation, she nodded knowingly. She had apparently seen plenty of strange neighborhood disputes escalate into soil contamination complaints. I filled out paperwork describing the incident, checked the boxes for possible petroleum pollution, and left the samples in their custody for testing. Walking out of the building, I felt lighter. For the first time since this started, I had taken a step that Karen couldn't immediately undo with a clipboard or a loud speech. The waiting was the hardest part. For several days, I tried to go about my routine while the lawn outside continued to look like a forgotten parking lot. Every time I glanced out the window, I saw the streaks of black cutting across the grass and felt my frustration rise again. Karen strutted past daily, pretending not to notice the evidence of her handiwork. It was infuriating, but I forced myself to be patient. If the lab confirmed petroleum contamination, her story about community beautification would unravel completely. When the call finally came, I was sitting at my kitchen table, sorting through the fake violation notices she had plastered on my door. The extension agent's voice was calm but firm as she explained the results. The soil showed clear traces of motor oil and other petroleum byproducts, the kind that could only come from deliberate dumping. She said the contamination levels were severe enough to warrant environmental concern and that I would receive a written report in the mail. I hung up the phone and sat back, staring at the stack of bogus fines on my table. For the first time since this nightmare began, I smiled. I had proof, not just suspicion. Proof that would follow Karen like a shadow she couldn't shake. The lab results had barely been in my hands for a day when Karen struck again. This time, she came armed with a bag of cat litter, the cheap clay kind that leaves dust clouds when you pour it. I watched from my window as she marched across the street with the bag slung over her shoulder like she was about to salt a winter sidewalk. Without hesitation, she tore it open and began scattering handfuls across the oil-stained patches of my lawn. The white granules clumped instantly on contact, turning gray and soggy as they mixed with the petroleum. To her, this was apparently what passed for remediation. She worked with exaggerated precision, crouching low to spread it evenly, as if she were conducting a science experiment. I stepped outside to confront her, asking what she thought she was doing this time. She looked up at me with a triumphant smile and announced that she was neutralizing the hazard I had created. According to her, the cat litter would soak up the contamination and restore balance to the soil. The way she said it, you would think she was a certified environmental specialist instead of a neighbor with a grudge and a coupon for pet supplies. The absurdity of it might have been laughable if it weren't so destructive. Clumps of the stuff gathered in thick piles, creating an even bigger mess than before. The once green lawn now looked like a battlefield where oil, clay, and grass fought for survival. A breeze picked up and carried the fine dust into the air, coating my porch railing and even settling on my car parked in the breeze. Driveway. I coughed, waved my hand, and told her to stop immediately. She ignored me, muttering something about civic duty and how some people needed to learn responsibility. By the time she emptied the bag, the yard looked worse than ever. What little grass had survived the oil was now buried under a chalky crust that would suffocate anything trying to grow. Karen dusted off her hands, stood tall, and told me I should be grateful. She said not every neighbor would go out of their way to fix another person's mistakes. Then she marched back across the street, leaving behind a yard that resembled a poorly maintained construction site. Watching her retreat, I realized she wasn't just sabotaging me. She was trying to build a story where every action she took painted me as the careless one and her as the hero. 2 days after Karen spread her cat litter cure across my yard, the sky finally opened up with one of those steady weekend rains that soaks everything for hours. I stood at my window and watched as the water ran down the street in dark, oily streams, carrying bits of white grit from the litter with it. My yard became a slick patchwork of black puddles and pale clumps, the grass completely hidden under the mess. The smell of wet petroleum grew so strong that I had to close the windows just to keep it from seeping into the house. Late that morning, a delivery van pulled up. The driver hopped out with a package tucked under his arm, jogging toward my porch with the casual rhythm of someone used to making 100 stops a day. The second his boot hit the edge of my lawn, he lost his footing. His legs shot forward, his arms flailed, and the package flew into the air before he landed hard on his side. The sound of the thud carried even over the rain, followed by a sharp curse as he scrambled to his knees. I rushed outside and helped him up, my hands slick with mud and oil as I steadied him. His uniform was smeared with black streaks, and the bottom of his jeans were soaked with the runoff. He shook his head in disbelief, muttering that he had never seen a yard so slippery. The package, thankfully, was only a little damp, but the shoe he left behind told the real story. When he stood, one boot stayed planted in the muck, suctioned into the oily ground like it was cement. It took both of us pulling together to free it, and even then the sole was coated in grime. The driver looked back at the yard with wide eyes and said, "I should file a complaint with the city before someone got seriously hurt." He limped back to his van, leaving behind black footprints on the sidewalk that trailed like evidence from a crime scene. As I watched him drive away, the weight of what just happened sank in. This wasn't just about my lawn anymore. Karen's reckless stunt had turned my property into a hazard for anyone who stepped onto it. One slip, one bad fall, and I would be the one answering questions about liability. She had managed to put me in danger even when I had done nothing wrong. The morning after the delivery man's fall, I stepped outside to find Karen's white SUV parked directly in front of my house. It wasn't just pulled up to the curb. It was angled in such a way that it blocked the edge of my driveway, leaving barely enough room for me to back my own car out. She stood on her porch sipping coffee, watching me as though daring me to say something. The spotless paint gleamed under the sunlight, every curve polished, the chrome trim reflecting like a mirror. She had chosen the spot deliberately, staking her claim on space that had never been hers. I walked down to the curb and asked her why she had parked there when she had an open driveway of her own. Her reply came sweetly, almost too sweet, dripping with that artificial tone she used whenever she wanted to sound polite, but really meant the opposite. She said she needed to protect her vehicle from neighborhood vandals and that my curb offered better visibility. It was the kind of excuse that sounded flimsy even as she said it. Everyone knew Karen considered her SUV sacred, so of course she wanted it placed where she could keep constant watch. The longer I stared at that gleaming machine sitting where it didn't belong, the more the irony twisted inside me. My yard had been destroyed, my soil poisoned, yet her pride and joy sat untouched like a throne on wheels. It was impossible not to notice the contrast between my stained lawn and her immaculate car. The thought hit me hard that she could ruin everything I had worked for while continuing to flaunt the one thing she valued most. Neighbors passing by slowed their pace, casting quick glances between the car and my yard. Some shook their heads, clearly recognizing the provocation. Karen smiled at them as though she were hosting a parade, waving casually and telling one couple she was keeping an eye on things because of my so-called hazards. I clenched my jaw and stepped back inside, but the image stayed with me. That SUV had become more than just her vehicle. It was the perfect symbol of her arrogance. Every polished surface mocked the black stains that still coated my grass, and deep down, I knew it wouldn't stay that way forever. That morning, as I stood on my porch staring at the gleaming SUV parked like a trophy in front of my ruined lawn, something in me shifted. For days I had tried to reason, tried to document, tried to stay calm in the face of Karen's antics. I had spoken logically, gathered evidence, and even filed reports, yet she kept pushing, kept escalating, and kept smiling as though nothing could touch her. Looking at that spotless white vehicle against the backdrop of my grass, now dead and slick with oil, I felt the anger settle into something sharper. I realized she had given me a constant reminder of what mattered to her most, parked right there within arm's reach. The contrast was impossible to ignore. My lawn, once green and carefully tended, was a mess of black streaks and gray clumps. Her car, on the other hand, sparkled like a showroom model, free of even a speck of dirt. Every time the sunlight caught its polished surface, I felt like she was mocking me without saying a word. She had ruined what I valued, and now she was flaunting what she valued, daring me to watch. I tried to busy myself inside, but my eyes kept drifting back to the window. Each time I saw that SUV sitting smugly by the curb, the thought grew louder in my head. If justice was ever going to arrive, it needed a target, and she had parked it right in front of me. I imagined her shock, her outrage, the exact look that would cross her face when the one thing she loved most became a reflection of the very mess she had created. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about balance. She had tipped the scales with her jug of oil, her fake violations, and her smug lectures. Restoring them meant showing her that actions carry consequences, that destruction doesn't stay contained to the victim. I could feel my pulse quicken as the idea solidified. My patience was gone. Logic had failed. Documentation had only given her more time to invent new stories. But that car, that immaculate car, was her weak spot. And as I stood there on my porch, watching the morning light glint off its hood, I knew exactly where the oil belonged next. Once the decision was made, I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing as carefully as if I were tackling a home project. I pulled on gloves, heavy-duty ones I usually used for yard work, and brought out buckets from the shed. The oil still clung thick across the surface of my lawn, collecting in shallow puddles that reflected the sun with a rainbow shimmer. The smell had grown stronger over the past few days, bitter and metallic, seeping into everything. Kneeling down, I dipped the first bucket into the muck, watching the black liquid slide against the sides before settling at the bottom. It felt wrong to handle something so destructive, but the act itself steadied me. I worked slowly, methodically, scooping and transferring, the sound of the liquid sloshing in rhythm with my movements. Each time I filled a bucket, I emptied it into larger containers, lined up along the edge of my garage. It took nearly 2 hours to gather enough to make the lawn look less like a toxic swamp and more like damaged ground. Sweat ran down my neck and the gloves grew sticky, but I kept going, determined not to stop until I had collected every drop that I could salvage. The process became strangely satisfying. Every scoop felt like reclaiming something Karen had taken from me. The dead patches of grass were still there, scarred and brown, but at least I was no longer staring at pools of poison soaking deeper into the soil. By the time the last container was sealed, I stood back and looked at the row of filled canisters. They sat there like soldiers waiting for orders, heavy and full, proof of both her crime and my patience finally running out. I washed my gloves and left the containers in the garage, lining them up neatly where no one could see. The whole time, my mind kept circling back to the same thought. The oil didn't belong on my lawn. It didn't belong in the soil, or in the gutter, or in the air around my home. There was only one place it truly belonged now, one place where the lesson would be impossible to ignore. I closed the garage door quietly, a strange calm settling over me. My yard had been ruined, but my plan was finally alive. When the neighborhood settled into silence that night, I knew it was time. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the steady hum of crickets made the air feel thicker than usual. I moved carefully, carrying one of the heavy containers from the garage, as though I were transporting something fragile. The weight of it pulled at my arms, reminding me with every step of the mess she had dumped onto my lawn. My heart pounded louder than the insects, but the calm determination in me drowned out the nerves. Karen's house sat dark except for the faint glow of a television in the living room. Her SUV gleamed under the streetlight, polished so perfectly that even at 1 a.m, it looked as though it had been washed that very afternoon. I set the container down gently, unscrewed the funnel I had hidden in my jacket, and took one last look around. No blinds twitched, no doors opened. The neighborhood slept while I crouched beside the machine she treasured most. The smell hit me as soon as I tipped the container. Thick and heavy, the oil slid slowly through the funnel and into the tank, with a sound that was almost delicate, like syrup dripping. Each second felt longer than the last, the kind of moments where you expect headlights to appear at any time, but nothing stirred. It was just me, the funnel, and the slow, steady transfer of every ounce of destruction she had poured onto my property. When the last drop slid through, I pulled the funnel free and wiped the lip with a rag I had brought for that purpose. I tightened the gas cap, careful to leave everything looking untouched. Standing up, I felt the cool night air brush against the sweat on my forehead. The SUV sat exactly as it had before, silent and pristine, hiding the truth in its belly. I walked back across the street carrying the empty container, my pulse beginning to slow. The garage door shut softly behind me as I set it down among the others. For the first time in days, the smell of oil no longer felt like defeat. It smelled like justice waiting to start an engine. The next morning began quietly, the kind of calm that almost convinced me the night before had been a dream. Sunlight bounced off the rooftops, birds pecked at the edges of driveways, and for a brief moment I wondered if I had gone too far. That thought disappeared the second Karen strutted outside in her usual weekend routine, clutching her travel mug and jingling her keys loud enough for half the street to hear. She walked straight to her spotless SUV, tossed her bag into the passenger seat, and slid behind the wheel with the air of someone about to remind the world of her importance. I leaned against my porch railing and watched as she turned the key. At first, the SUV gave its usual confident growl, but then it choked. The sound twisted into an ugly cough, followed by a sputter that made her head jerk back in confusion. She tried again. This time the engine caught for a second, then released a plume of smoke that curled upward, dark and acrid, drifting across the clear morning sky. She sat frozen for a moment, gripping the wheel, before giving it a third attempt. The same result, a weak groan, another puff of smoke, and then silence. The smell rolled over to my porch almost immediately. It was unmistakable, the same bitter, greasy stench that had clung to my lawn for days. The irony hit me so hard I nearly laughed out loud. That smell no longer represented my ruined yard. It was now seeping directly from the pride of her life, the very thing she polished and guarded, as if it were more valuable than any neighborly goodwill. Karen climbed out of the SUV, coughing, waving the smoke from her face, and looking around as though someone might rush to her rescue. Instead, the street remained still, neighbors peeking from behind curtains, trying not to be obvious. She kicked at the tire, muttering angrily, and tried the key once more before realizing nothing was going to change. The car that had been her throne was now a coughing wreck, gasping with every attempt to start. I sipped my coffee and let the corners of my mouth curl upward. Justice had a sound, and it was the pitiful wheeze of her white SUV refusing to roar back to life. By mid-morning, the entire block knew something was wrong. Karen was not the type to suffer in silence, and her voice carried through the street like a Dodigo, warning siren. She stormed back and forth in front of her SUV, hands waving, clipboard tucked under her arm, as if the very sight of it gave her authority. She shouted that someone had sabotaged her vehicle, that criminals were roaming free, and that she would not rest until the culprit was exposed. The irony of her claiming victimhood, while my lawn still bore the scars of her oil dump, was not lost on anyone. She gathered a small circle of neighbors, most of whom looked uncomfortable as she launched into her tirade. She pointed at me more than once, her voice sharp and shrill, insisting that I had framed her out of jealousy. According to her, my ruined lawn was a cover story, and the real crime was that I was envious of her spotless car and her influence in the neighborhood. The more she spoke, the less convincing she sounded, yet she carried on with absolute confidence, scribbling notes on her clipboard and vowing that she would present her findings at an emergency meeting. From my porch I listened, arms crossed, letting her dig the hole deeper. I did not need to interrupt or defend myself. Her theatrics were doing the work for me. Every exaggerated accusation only made her look more unhinged. A few neighbors exchanged glances, some shaking their heads quietly. One woman muttered that Karen should call a mechanic instead of wasting everyone's time. Karen, of course, heard none of it. She declared that the entire block was under siege, that this attack on her SUV was an attack on the whole community. She raised her clipboard like it was a shield and promised she would get to the bottom of it. Her voice cracked at one point, though she quickly masked it with another burst of righteous anger. Watching her meltdown, I realized she was unraveling faster than I expected. The SUV was not just a vehicle to her. It was her armor, her identity, her proof of superiority. Seeing it crippled had shaken her more than any fine or argument ever could. And now, with smoke still curling faintly from the hood, she was screaming into the void, desperate to regain control that was slipping through her fingers. The tow truck arrived just after noon, its rumble echoing down the street as neighbors peeked through blinds to catch a glimpse of the drama. Karen stood at the curb, arms folded tightly, her foot tapping with impatience. She greeted the mechanic like he was a surgeon about to save a beloved family member. She explained loudly that her vehicle had been vandalized and that she expected a full investigation into who had dared commit such an atrocity. The mechanic, a middle-aged man with grease on his hands and the patience of someone who had heard every excuse in the book, simply asked for the keys. Karen handed them over with a flourish, as though she were presenting a sacred relic. He slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and immediately frowned as the SUV wheezed and coughed before releasing another puff of foul smoke. He popped the hood, leaned in, and after only a few seconds, shook his head slowly. Karen hovered behind him, clipboard still in hand, scribbling notes as if documenting evidence. When he finally spoke, his voice was blunt and matter-of-fact. He explained that the fuel system was contaminated. Then he paused, sniffed the air rising from the tank, and delivered the line that made me nearly choke on my laughter. "Lady, this thing's full of oil." His words hung in the air like a hammer blow. For the first time in days, Karen's expression faltered. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She blinked rapidly, searching for a rebuttal that would not come. The mechanic straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag, clearly uninterested in her protests. He explained that the vehicle would need serious work, probably a full replacement of major components, and that the cost would not be cheap. He gave her a figure that made her gasp so loudly half the block heard it. She insisted that someone had deliberately poisoned her SUV, pointing across the street at me while her voice climbed higher. The mechanic only shrugged and said it did not matter how it happened, the result was the same. As the tow truck driver hooked chains to her prized possession, Karen paced like a cornered animal, sputtering threats and promises of revenge. Watching her beloved car being hauled away, lifeless and defeated, was a sight I knew I would never forget. By late afternoon, the whole neighborhood seemed to know about the verdict on Karen's SUV. Word had traveled faster than the tow truck, and by the time she returned from the mechanic's lot, everyone was waiting to see what she would do next. She marched up and down the sidewalk, clipboard clutched tight, her voice booming as she recited accusations like a prosecutor in a courtroom. She pointed at each neighbor in turn, demanding to know who had tampered with her vehicle. Children were pulled indoors, dogs were yanked back on leashes, and still she kept going, her finger stabbing the air as though sheer force could conjure a confession. When she reached my property, her voice sharpened into a shriek. She claimed I had orchestrated the entire thing, that I had faked the oil spill on my lawn as part of a conspiracy to discredit her. She called me jealous, bitter, and unfit to live in a respectable neighborhood. Every word was designed to paint her as the victim, even while the black stains on my grass remained in plain view. I stepped onto my porch slowly, letting her rant echo across the street until her words began to lose steam. When she finally paused, I held up the folder I had received from the county extension office that morning. Inside were the soil test results, clear as day, showing high levels of petroleum contamination. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply announced that the county had confirmed the cause of the damage and that the report was available for anyone who wanted to read it. A murmur spread through the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered, their curiosity outweighing their fear of Karen's wrath. She sputtered, tried to wave it off as fabricated, but Tom spoke up from the edge of his driveway, reminding everyone that he had witnessed her dumping the oil. Another neighbor added that they had seen her carrying the bag of cat litter earlier in the week. Piece by piece, her story unraveled, and no amount of shouting could stitch it back together. Karen's face flushed red as she clutched her clipboard tighter, retreating toward her porch with muttered threats about lawsuits and revenge. But the shift was clear. For the first time, the neighborhood was looking at her, not me, with suspicion. The SUV had been her shield, but now it was gone, and all that remained was her crumbling authority. The following week brought an unexpected development. Instead of Karen's voice carrying through the street, it was the sound of county inspectors pulling up in a white government vehicle. Two men in safety vests stepped out, clipboards in hand, their expressions serious as they surveyed the neighborhood. Someone, likely the mechanic who had handled the ruined SUV, had reported the contamination. Within minutes they were walking my property, snapping photographs of the blackened soil, and jotting notes about the oily runoff that had spread to the gutter. Karen emerged from her house almost instantly, her robe flapping as she hurried over to intercept them. She spoke in her usual confident tone, explaining loudly that she had been the one to alert the authorities about my so-called negligence. She gestured toward my lawn like she was unveiling evidence in a courtroom, insisting that I had caused environmental damage that threatened the entire community. The inspectors listened politely, though their pens never stopped moving. When they turned to me, I calmly handed them the official lab report from the extension office, already signed and dated. Their eyes scanned the pages, and one of them gave a short nod. The document left little room for doubt. The contamination was the result of deliberate petroleum dumping, and the report confirmed it had come from outside interference rather than neglect. They asked if I had any idea who might be responsible, and before I could answer, Tom stepped forward from his porch. He explained that he had witnessed Karen pouring oil onto my grass, and had even recorded a portion of it on his phone. The inspectors requested to see the footage, and Tom obliged, replaying the clip where Karen appeared in full view, carrying the jug and tilting it across the yard. The evidence was undeniable. Karen's voice rang out defensively, claiming the video was taken out of context, but the inspectors barely acknowledged her. They finished their notes, informed me that I would receive official confirmation in the mail, and turned to Karen with measured seriousness. They explained that the county would be pursuing follow-up action regarding illegal disposal of hazardous materials. Karen's confident mask cracked for the first time. She stood frozen on the sidewalk, her clipboard limp at her side, while the inspectors returned to their vehicle. The balance of power had shifted. This time, it wasn't just neighbors watching her unravel. It was the county itself, and their clipboards carried consequences she could not shout away. The inspectors did not waste time. Just 3 days after their visit, an envelope arrived in Karen's mailbox, with the county seal stamped on the front. I was sitting on my porch when she retrieved it, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, clearly expecting validation of her endless complaints. She tore it open on the spot, scanning the pages with a smug expression that faltered almost immediately. Her mouth fell open, her face drained of color, and then a strangled sound escaped her throat. I knew what she was holding. The county had mailed me a copy as well, along with an apology for the inconvenience caused by the contamination. The letter explained in crisp official language that a fine of $3,200 had been issued to Karen for the illegal dumping of petroleum on residential property. It listed the date of the violation, the evidence provided, and a stern warning that further incidents would result in criminal charges. The number sat bold at the bottom of the page, impossible to ignore. From across the street, I watched her grip the letter tighter, shaking it as if the words might change if she rattled them enough. She spun around, waving it toward her porch as though someone inside might confirm that this was a clerical mistake. There was no one to answer her. For the first time, she stood alone with no crowd of neighbors, no folding chairs lined in her driveway, no one nodding along to her speeches. The beauty of it was that the fine came from a place she could not manipulate. She could not rewrite the county's letter, she could not tape her own version to my door, and she could not lecture her way out of the official seal stamped in blue ink. Her authority dissolved in the sunlight as she stormed back inside, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows. Later that evening, whispers moved through the neighborhood. People had seen her reaction, and news of the fine spread quickly. Some chuckled quietly on their porches, others shook their heads with relief that someone had finally held her accountable. For me, the satisfaction came not from her financial loss, but from knowing the truth was written in permanent ink on county letterhead. The fight was no longer just between her and me. The system itself had spoken, and this time it had chosen the right side. The fine was only the beginning of Karen's unraveling. Once word spread, the rest of the neighborhood began questioning her authority more openly. For years, she had acted as though she were the head of some invisible board, issuing warnings, drafting phony violations, and hosting meetings that felt more like interrogations than discussions. People had tolerated it, partly out of habit and partly out of fear of becoming her next target. But after the county's letter, the illusion of her power cracked wide open. A group of neighbors gathered one evening at the community center, not because Karen had called for it, but because they wanted to decide what to do about her constant interference. I showed up unsure of what to expect, only to find nearly 24 residents seated in folding chairs, their voices buzzing with frustration. Someone finally said aloud what many had been whispering for years. Karen had no legitimate role, no title, and no authority. The homeowners association she claimed to represent had dissolved long ago. All she had been doing was exploiting people's ignorance of the fact, and she had gotten away with it until her obsession with my lawn exposed her. The vote to strip her of her self-appointed presidency was swift. Hands rose in unison, some shaking with relief, others raised with almost gleeful energy. The decision was unanimous, and for the first time, the neighborhood agreed on something. A written statement followed, signed by every resident in attendance, declaring that Karen no longer represented them in any capacity, and that any documents she issued would be considered fraudulent. Copies were placed in mailboxes the next morning. When Karen discovered the letter on her porch, her reaction echoed down the street. She tore it into pieces and hurled them onto her lawn, screaming that the community was ungrateful and blind to her sacrifices. Yet, even as she shouted, curtains remained closed and doors stayed shut. No one stepped outside to support her. The spell had broken. For me, the moment carried a deeper satisfaction than even the county fine. It was not just about money or punishment. It was about watching an entire block reclaim its voice. The neighborhood that once trembled under her rules had finally stood together, and in that unity, her reign ended. Karen, who had thrived on control, was left with nothing but the echo of her own rage. Karen's SUV returned on the back of a tow truck a week later, but it was no longer the gleaming centerpiece she once paraded like a crown jewel. The hood sat propped open, the engine gutted and silent, wires dangling like exposed veins. The glossy paint still shone in places, but it could not disguise the fact that the vehicle was now a monument to failure. Neighbors slowed their walks to look, shaking their heads, whispering under their breath, and some even snapping photos from a distance. The car that had once represented her pride now stood as an unintentional billboard for everything she had lost. She left it parked in her driveway, unmoving, day after day. At first, she tried to keep up appearances, draping a cover over it like a bandage hiding a wound. But the shape of the SUV was unmistakable, and the cover only seemed to draw more attention. When the wind caught it one afternoon and exposed the dead vehicle beneath, she gave up on the pretense. After that, it sat bare, white paint reflecting the sun while the open hood screamed defeat. Karen could not avoid walking past it every time she stepped outside. Each time, her expression grew tighter, her lips pressed into a thin line, her shoulders rigid. When our eyes met across the street, she glared with such intensity that I could almost feel the heat of it. She did not need words to make her resentment known. That car had been her shield, her badge of superiority, and now it had become the daily reminder that she was not untouchable. The irony was almost too perfect. While my lawn slowly began to heal, sprouting faint green shoots through the damaged soil, her driveway hosted the corpse of her most cherished possession. The imbalance had shifted completely. What she had tried to destroy in me had circled back to her in a form she could not deny. Each morning as I watered the grass, I caught sight of her standing at her window, peering out with eyes that held both fury and despair. It was strange to realize I no longer needed to argue with her or even speak. The ruined SUV had become the statement I could never put into words, sitting silent in her driveway, louder than any speech she had ever given. 2 months passed, and the sharp stink of oil that once hung over my property finally began to fade. The county had overseen cleanup efforts, and with time, the ground recovered. Grass seed sprouted in careful rows, and by early summer, a lush carpet of green stretched across my yard once more. It was not the same lawn I had before, but in some ways, it felt even better. Each blade that pushed through the soil felt like proof that the damage could be undone, that resilience could grow where destruction had tried to take root. Neighbors noticed the change too. People who once avoided walking past now paused to compliment the recovery, some even stopping to chat about how glad they were to see life return to the yard. Their words carried warmth that had been absent during the darker days of Karen's campaign. The conversations reminded me that the community had not abandoned me after all. They had simply needed time to see past her noise. Meanwhile, across the street, Karen's SUV remained in her driveway like a relic of her downfall. She had tried to sell it, but word spread quickly about the damage, and no buyer wanted to take on a vehicle with a fuel system ruined beyond repair. Eventually, she sold it for scrap, though even the tow truck that hauled it away seemed to hesitate before taking on such a cursed load. Watching it disappear around the corner brought a quiet satisfaction, not because I celebrated her loss, but because it marked the end of the symbol she had clung to so desperately. Every evening I watered the lawn, letting the hose sweep gently over the new shoots. The air smelled of damp earth instead of chemicals, and the sound of water pattering against fresh grass replaced the sickening squelch of oil-soaked ground. Sometimes, while I worked, I would catch Karen watching from her window. Her eyes followed the spray of water, narrowing as though each drop mocked her. I never waved or called out. I simply carried on, calm and steady, knowing the image spoke for itself. What began as sabotage had transformed into renewal. My yard thrived, her car was gone, and the balance had returned. In the end, the green beneath my feet stood taller than her pride ever could. And that's how my lawn went from oil slick to emerald green, while Karen's precious white SUV went from showroom sparkle to junkyard special. If you've made it this far, congrats, you survived one of the messiest neighborhood wars in history. Remember, some Karens fight with clipboards, some fight with noise complaints, and some fight with motor oil. But at the end of the day, karma has a way of finding the perfect delivery system. Smash that subscribe button if you love stories where poetic justice gets poured right back where it belongs. Drop a comment with your wildest neighbor meltdown seriously. Sharing helps all of us process the insanity. Until next time, may your lawn stay green, your engine stay clean, and your Karens always sabotage themselves harder than you ever could.